The death toll from an attack on a school in western Uganda has risen to 41. Now, according to police, victims include students, a guard, and 2 members of the local community who were killed outside a school. 8 people were injured in the attack and 6 others abducted. The country has since deployed the army to pursue the attackers from the Allied Democratic Forces. This is not the group's first attack, on a school in Uganda. In June of 1998, 80 students were burnt to death in their dormitories after an attack on a technical school near the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The United Nations says it is deeply troubled by the deterioration in human rights in Senegal. The organization has slammed the use of firearms by security forces during protests which erupted after the leading opposition figure, Ousmane Sonko, was sentenced to 2 years in prison. At least 16 people died during the violence.
At least 16 people were killed, 350 injured, and more than 500 arrested during 3 days of protesting in Senegal between the 1st and the 3rd of June after security forces incited violence and used firearms on protesters. The United Nations has since called out Senegal for human rights violations.
The use of firearms by security forces during protests sets a negative precedent for Senegal. We note that the authorities have launched investigations and call on them to ensure that the investigations into this use of force are prompt, independent, and thorough, and to bring anyone found to be responsible for unnecessary and disproportionate force to account, regardless of their status and political affiliation.
Public and private property, banks and shops were ransacked as groups of protesting youngsters confronted security forces in support of popular 48-year-old leader of the Patriots for Work, Ethics and Fraternity Party, who was sentenced to 2 years in jail for corrupting the youth after being acquitted on rape charges. Meanwhile, the United Nations has also raised concerns over the ongoing restrictions on freedom of expression and peaceful gatherings in the wake of the protests. This includes the unjustified suspension of a private station, Walfadjri TV, which was covering the protests live from the 1st of June to date.
It is the primary responsibility of Senegalese authorities to preserve the country's long-held respect for democratic traditions and the rule of law by guaranteeing the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and expression, as well as the right to information by ensuring that journalists can exercise their profession freely and safely, particularly in the run-up to the 2024 presidential election.
The protests by Sonko supporters across the country are expected to gain momentum as Sonko, who has claimed that the government cooked up the charges to stop him from running for president again next year, has yet to be taken into custody to serve his jail term. It is likely to cause further tensions. He is currently confined to his Dakar home, where he has been blocked in by security forces since the weekend.
The bloody Sudan conflict entered its 3rd month on Thursday with no sign of a resolution between the state armed forces and the rapid support force. Now, the death toll is said to have passed 2,000. For more on this, we are now joined by African Leadership Center Executive Director Shuvai Busuman Nyoni. Shuvai, thank you so much for joining us this evening. The war has entered its 3rd month. Do you think that the people of Sudan had anticipated for this war to go on for this long?
Good evening, Katlego, and thank you so much to you and to your viewers. I think not many people anticipated that the conflict would escalate to this level so quickly, but I also think that many in Sudan were living on tenterhooks for quite some time with the unresolved political nature of the issues in the country, and anticipated that there could be an armed conflict between the 2 generals. But the severity and the overwhelming nature of destruction, loss of life that we are seeing, I don't think is something that anyone was prepared for.
Speaking about loss of life, Governor Kamis Abaka had made remarks that were critical to the paramilitaries in a telephonic interview, and we know that he has now subsequently died. Do you think that his death will now exacerbate things in that region?
I think it's important to note that the region where the governor was from and where he was expressing concern about, West Darfur in the Darfur region of Sudan, is a region that has gone through 2 or more decades of conflict. The conflict that started on 15 April has simply exacerbated the underlying conflict that was already happening in that region. Over the last few weeks, we have seen increased violence, increased movement of people, refugees, internally displaced people from that region into eastern Chad that borders Sudan. And the situation in parts of West Darfur, in parts of that region, is actually unknown, the extent of destruction, the extent of loss of life, because in some of the areas there's even been loss of communication with the outside world.
Shuvai, I just want us to get into some of the issues around aid and neglect of the particular region. I mean, 25 million people are said to be in need of aid, and the UN has only received a fraction of what they had requested. Earlier this month, the Norwegian Refugee Council had released a report on the most neglected crises in the globe. 10 countries had been identified, 7 of which were from the African continent. Now, in comparison to the conflict that's currently happening in Ukraine, this report shows that $212 was raised per person inside Ukraine, while only $52 was raised per person in some of these countries, the 7 countries of the most neglected crises across the globe. Why do you think that we are, as Africans, receiving only a fraction of some of the aid that is requested, as opposed to what now has been raised for Ukraine?
I mean, I think some of these issues go back a little bit before even the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine conflict. There has always been a disparity in what comes to the continent by way of aid, by way of relief, humanitarian support. And also, if we look back to COVID, the COVID pandemic, we see that some of these challenges had already arisen. I think, though, notwithstanding the limited amount of humanitarian assistance, one of the things we are currently facing in the Sudan situation is the difficulty or almost impossibility of humanitarian assistance to reach those most in need. As your viewers would have seen in previous reports, there have been several failed ceasefires in Sudan, and one of the most important issues with the ceasefires has been the opening of humanitarian corridors. So even if humanitarian aid comes even from neighboring countries, which I think ought to be called upon to provide and to support, and I think there have been some pledges made by neighboring countries, by other countries in the continent, it is very difficult for this aid to reach those most in need in Sudan right now at this time.
Lastly, Shuvai, is an end in sight for this particular war?
That is very difficult to say, but what I can say is that where we are right now is that there is need to acknowledge the worsening and dire nature of this crisis, and it is a crisis. I think, secondly, there is need to call out at the highest levels with the greatest severity and seriousness the 2 generals who are behind this conflict. There is need to acknowledge the suffering of Sudanese people. There is need to acknowledge the work and the efforts that civic actors in Sudan have been taking to resolve this conflict. And also, I think, lastly, that we're at a point where we need an all-continental and all-African response to this. The IGAD has responded, and they are trying to see the 2 generals in the next couple of weeks. But I think we are way beyond that, and there is a need for an all-continental response to put pressure on the 2 men to stop fighting.
All right, Shuvai, thank you so much for your time.